Chris, go ahead and pull my slides up. That would be helpful. I want to let you know we got a new series coming up after Easter, and I've been hemming and hawing about different things that I wanted to do, and then actually it was in I think one of my groups, but Lauren mentioned he heard a podcast that our own Sam Altus, we're going to call him our own until he's not our own, he has a great podcast where he interviews all kinds of voices from around Christendom and even beyond Christendom, and you can catch that out. It's called A Better Story, I think, podcast. And he interviewed Adam Hamilton. Now, you may be familiar with Adam Hamilton because he's the author of the book Making Sense of the Bible that we peddle around here, which I really appreciate and helps have a different view of scriptures altogether. Well, he wrote a new book called Unafraid. And so Lauren was talking about this interview, and so I went and listened to the interview, and that's what we're going to do after Easter. I don't often do book series, probably over the course of my many years here. If you really counted up how many Sundays were wrapped around a book, not many, really, by comparison. But what this does for us, and then this is a good case in point, what we're just coming off of. It gives you multiple opportunities to stretch and grow and go deeper. So you hear me Sunday interacting with Borg and giving my own, insights on how it affects me. You can read Borg. You can come to the Wednesday night class and go deeper and hear what other people are thinking about it. And so it will be for this next course coming up. So the book is called Unafraid, and it has to do with how we live in our time, which is very anxiety-filled. And it's going to last us a while, but I actually think it's going to be excellent. Very different than this course. This course that we're just finishing up is pretty theological. We're dealing with some deep weed issue kinds of things. This next one coming up is going to have some great biblical stories we're going to look at, but it's also going to be deeply practical. And so I wanted to balance things out that way, and so that's going to be starting after Easter, and I'm looking forward to that. Another thing I wanted to mention, Dar touched on this briefly, has to do with membership and baptism. Membership. It's not just so you get to vote on whether or not to fire me or not. It's even more fun than that. Really, there are two whys behind membership that I want to articulate. First, the why is behind the church, why we would want you to join. And really the biggest reason is because it lets us know where you are in your relationship with the church. Until you really pull that trigger, we're not quite sure if you count yourself as part of the family in that kind of relationship with us or not. And so what that can do at times is make us a little tentative. Because in not saying, yeah, I want to go deep with you guys, even if you don't realize it, you are kind of creating a bit of a boundary there, saying, I'm not quite there yet. And so it makes us reluctant, particularly in difficult times, to feel like we have the right to come alongside maybe as fully or as much as we would. Does that make any sense? Because we're not quite sure. It's like any other relationship. Once you've kind of settled, okay, we are deep, good friends, then you can just call. You can just say a word, and it will be welcome because you've kind of established that. Well, that's one of the huge things membership does on our side, selfishly, is it gives us a nod that you're in the game and you want to be part of that. And you give us license to speak into your life in very positive ways, I think. But the other side is for you, and this, I don't think in our culture we realize what this does. Something happens and shifts in you when you commit. When you choose to make roots, be it in a relationship or in church membership, something shifts in you too. And it's a very good thing. You are saying you're putting down roots, that you believe in who we are and you want to be a part of that. It helps shape your identity a little bit stronger with this space. And you really don't know that that's happened until you do it. So for your own spiritual growth, it is good for you to commit and to be engaged in that kind of a rooted way. Gives you a little more skin in the game, and this becomes home in just a deeper level. So I hope you'll consider it. And the other thing has to do with baptism. Baptism is a 2,000-year-old ritual. that is incredible. And we don't just mess around with squirt guns and spraying you with stuff. No. We get every part of you wet, and I make sure of that. And that's the way it was intended to be. The Greek word for baptism actually is to immerse fully, and it was meant to be this incredibly powerful, multifaceted, rich, experiential event that was a statement to yourself, to God, to anybody who is viewing that you're in the game with Jesus, that you're charting a course hand in hand in the footsteps of Jesus. So if you've never done that, it's just amazing. It's an amazing experience. I've been baptized twice. The first time was when I was in 4th grade, and I meant it. It was a kid thing, and so if you've got kids somewhere around that age, they're thinking, hey, maybe this is something I want to do. Great. But then as an adult later on, I made the decision in an adult, mature way to follow, and was baptized at 20, I think, 21, somewhere in there. And that was incredibly moving as well. So anyway, if you're interested in that, let us know, because we love to do that and do it well here. Okay, so on to today. Heart and home, being a Christian in an age of religious pluralism. I'm going to say this at the very end, but I'll just say it to you now so that we're clear with each other. I am, as much as I can be, a fully devoted follower of Jesus. And what I mean by can be is, as much as I know that I can be doing in my life, I'm doing the best I can to hear the voice of God, understand the footsteps of Jesus, and follow in that regard. And I have no intent on trading camps. I'm deeply happy as a Christian person, and I don't see that ever changing. And I say that because we're talking about religious pluralism today. And that is, I kind of forget, is a touchy subject in our world. And I kind of forgot that that's a sensitive issue in our world. And especially now, probably more than it has been in recent years. And so I'm going to buzz through some of the academics that Borg gives you, help you get your brain around religious pluralism and Christianity's place within that a little bit, but just wanted to say that up front in case you wondered. Yep, still a Christian, still plan to be a Christian, and we'll see where we go. But first, a very important question. The question is, which of the above athletes do you like most? Some of these guys you didn't even know were athletes, perhaps. So we got Stephen Curry, Buster Posey, Jimmy Garoppolo, and Joe Pavelski. So raise your hand if of those four, Stephen Curry is your favorite. All right. Buster Posey. Anybody out there? All right. Jimmy Garoppolo? Okay. And any Sharks fans out there? Joe Pavelski? All right. One shy one that sort of did this. All right. You're welcome here even as a hockey fan. Honestly, you know, even though I grew up part of my life in Michigan, which is a huge hockey state, didn't really get into hockey all that much, and my sisters would be embarrassed that I had to actually dial up the Sharks roster to see who was the captain of the team. But apparently it's Joe Pavelski, and we're very happy that he is, aren't we? Well, all four of these people share a number of things in common. They're all fantastic athletes at the top of their game, but they are also the identified leaders of their teams, of the organization. Steph Curry, he is the captain of the Warriors. Buster Posey, I don't know if there's a captain, but he is the embodiment of the Giants. Everybody knows he is leading the Giants. My number one fan here, Lauren, is there an actual captain? Is he actually given that card or anything? I didn't think so, but everybody knows Buster Posey's it. He sets the tone for everything. Jimmy Garoppolo, by virtue that he's the new quarterback for the Niners, that makes him the leader of the team. A very expensive leader, I might add, of the team. And Joe Pavelski, boy, look at his stats, man. There's a reason this guy's captain of the Sharks. He's really incredible. So that gives you kind of what I'm looking for. Now, here's my next question. Which of these athletes is the best? Nice answer. They all are. That's right. Nice and safe. The reason why I asked that question is because it's kind of an impossible question to ask. If you were to ask, well, which of these players is best at basketball? Easy. Or baseball, or football, or hockey? Easy. But if you just ask flat out which player is best, you really can't answer it because the sports are different. And even though they are all amazing athletes in their respective sports, the way they play their respective games are pretty exclusive to their sport. The language they use, the strategy they use, the way they score, everything is unique to their particular sport. Are you with me? The rules of the sports vary between one to the other. So, Stephen Curry has never in his life at the arena, he has never stolen second base. He's also not ever been called out at home. Buster Posey has never scored a touchdown at AT&T Park. You get my drift here? It's kind of a silly game that we play. But I want you to use that as a metaphor. Metaphors all have their limits. But I want you to use that metaphor, this analogy, to think about world religions. And I want to ask you, out of Jesus, Moses, Muhammad, and Buddha, representing four of the largest, most enduring religions, so these have been around a very long time. And if there was one identifier for Hinduism, I would list that name as well, but that's more of a cultural, traditional religion than centered on one person's teaching or example. So those four people, if I ask who's best, well, you are going to say, well, Jesus, of course, because we're a Christian church. And you'd probably follow it closely with Moses because he's Jewish and Jesus was Jewish. And then after that, you'd probably go with Buddha, and because Americans have some serious misgivings about Islam, you'd probably put Muhammad way down at the bottom of the list. But when we ask the question, who is best, just like with sports, we got to ask the question, best at what and in what? Because their religions are different from another. And if you rank all of them on the basis of the Christian religion, it's a no-brainer. It's Jesus. But if you rank them on the basis of the religion of Islam, Jesus is highly regarded but misses the mark. And if you go with Buddhism, well, the other three, except for Buddha, they're disqualified because they believe in a specific type of God that Buddha does not speak of. And religions need to be thought of in similar ways. But that's difficult for us to do. The board gives us some framework to do this. So on the next slide, I've got a few things we're going to unpack. And just click along with me here with the space bar, if you would, Chris. The first thing should pop up is 3 ways of seeing religions. So we go to the first one. And this has to do with the absolutist understanding of religion. This is the one that has shaped most of us. Because we have primarily heard Christianity spoken through what we've been calling the earlier tradition, which has deep rootedness in fundamentalism, born out of a scientific revolutionary Enlightenment thinking, where things are sort of black and white, and it either is or it isn't, and there's not a lot of gray area, and we like our boxes and define them this way. We like empirical evidence and want to apply that to things of faith and mystery. We are very accustomed to the absolutist understanding of religion. In fact, some of us have even been brought into the faith with that, where we may have been kind of wandering around and somebody comes alongside and talks about Christianity to us, and we wonder, well, why Christianity? And they say, well, because it's the right religion. It's the only true religion. And verses in the scriptures themselves, even coming out of Jesus' mouth, are used to communicate that. And so, in essence, what is being communicated to us is, if you're in one of the other religions, you are in a false religion, because the only true right religion is Christianity. Now, that worked for a long time. That way of thinking worked for a long time in a world that couldn't talk to each other. But increasingly, over the last 100 years, more and more people have had eyes on each other. Cultures have mixed. Just since the mid-1960s, when immigration laws softened in the United States, all of a sudden, a non-European way of thinking about everything entered our land. And we started to see people and understand perspectives that quite literally were completely foreign to most folks. And now they're our neighbors. And now we're hearing their perspectives, whereas at once we couldn't. And now, with the age of the internet, you can tap into all kinds of things all over the world. And so people who have a problem with the absolutist understanding of religion, they can very quickly go into category number 2 on the next click, which is the reductionist understanding of religion. The reductionist understanding of religion, I think, is well represented by Ricky Gervais. You know who Ricky Gervais is? He's the guy that started The Office in the UK. He's a comedian, actor. He's good. I like his humor. He's a little off color, but he's one of these guys that plays an idiot and really, really well, making you feel completely uncomfortable with whatever setting is happening on the screen. Have you ever been that way? I mean, not Seinfeld, but Steve Carell did it well in The Office in the American version, where he would say something or behave a certain way in the show, and you're just like, oh, cringe factor, and you're just waiting for it to resolve. Well, Gervais is a master at that. But Gervais looked at the world's religions and kind of heard people saying some things that were similar, but then a lot of infighting between all of them saying, well, we're right and you're wrong, and back and forth like this. And Ricky Gervais woke up one day, I don't know, 10 years ago or so, and just said, forget it. I'm done with the whole thing. Well, I don't even know if there's a God anymore, but I'm certainly not going to pursue that. I'm not going to try to be spiritual because I don't even know if there's a God out there anymore. And he just sort of lump-summed it all as this human creation, fantasy, whatever, that mainly causes problems. And he just left the whole thing and walked away from it. And he's kind of famous for it now. In a recent men's magazine, he's one of the featured articles, and one of the primary things they talk about is this. So for a long time, he's been on interview shows, all that stuff. This comes up. And it is a response to the absolutist position. Because the absolutist position is, by its own definition, extreme. It's saying, we are the only one. And people who hear other perspectives and are thinking, I don't know if that makes any sense, they are very easily flocking to the reductionist perspective, which actually is becoming increasingly common in our United States. In fact, it is the fastest growing religion in the United States, is the religion of none. And part of it is a reaction to this absolutist extremist type of position. Well, Borg suggests, and I agree with him, that that's way too simplistic. You're broad-stroking way too much. You're throwing literally the baby out with the bathwater when you take that kind of a stance that all religions are a bunch of bunk, and so let's just scrap the whole thing and forget it all. I mean, if we told Ricky Gervais, okay, well then you need to do the same thing with sports, I wonder how he'd react. Because you kind of need to, Ricky. Because if you think basketball, and basketball players and fans are saying basketball is the greatest sport ever, but football players over here are saying, no, football is the greatest sport ever. And then you got Giants fans who are saying baseball is the greatest sport ever, particularly on even-numbered years. And you're thinking about all these things. You could come to the same conclusion. Let's just get rid of sports because they're all saying different things. And if they would just get along and score all their different things, you know, in the same way, it would all make sense. So you hear this and you're like, well, that's ridiculous. Your analogy is terrible, Pete. Get a new analogy. But you get what I'm saying? You got different games trying to understand the sport, the complexities, the rules, everything different, one sport to another. We don't throw out sports because different sports are saying different things. And I think the same is true with religion. And so Borg gives us a third alternative to think through how we think about religions. And that's this, the sacramental understanding of religion. Simply put, what this means is that we look at religion as actually having a purpose. And the purpose of religion as a whole is to be a conduit of the sacred to humanity and all creation. How well can we connect the sacred, however we understand that, and its mystery, and it is mysterious, how we help people connect with the divine. That's what the sacramental view is. And Borg, in the next click, he has a good quote. He says, "Understanding other religions can enrich our understanding of Christianity and what it means to be Christian. Religious pluralism can help us to see our own tradition better because we have a contrast to help us understand ourselves." So on the next slide, we get some things about what this means to view all the different religions as sacrament. The first one may make you a little uncomfortable, just because of tradition, though. And that is that religions are human creations. The fingerprints of the people who gave birth to the world's religions are all over their respective religions. So Abraham was influenced the way he was. Moses was influenced the way he was because of the time and the place that he lived. The whole thing wasn't just dropped out of the sky. They massaged it. And the rabbinical tradition and Jewish history was a constant back and forth discussion about how do we interpret this and that. And all of that they understood was rooted in how they understood life living in their culture. Religion in and of itself is a human creation. Are they seeking the divine? Yes, of course. In fact, religions are human creations in response to experiences of the sacred. So they didn't just wake up one day and think, all right, I think we need to figure out a good way to control humanity, so let's create this thing called religion so that we can do that effectively. Not their goal. These people, the founders that we're talking about, they had powerful experience of the inbreaking of the divine, and what they did next was the outworking of that. That's what I mean by the human side of it. Religions are also cultural linguistic traditions. Simply put, that means that there's a reason why they sound different from another, literally, and they use different language, one to know, is because they were born in different parts of the world. So Judaism and Christianity sound kind of similar, but Christianity shifts it in a kind of a new direction, obviously. But Buddhism is going to sound different than Islam because they're coming out of two different parts of the world. And those cultures and the language from those cultures and the analogies that are coming out are going to come from those particular contexts. Enduring religions are wisdom traditions. Every single enduring religion has their versions of proverbs and stories, parables to help you live a better life connected to God. And religions are aesthetic traditions. We don't often think about this, but this has to do with music and different forms of art, prayers that are written for the people, and poetry. We believe in the Christian tradition that God is fundamentally loving and good and graceful and beautiful and with us as creator. But some of the most beautiful poetry, speaking of this, of those realities I just mentioned, actually come out of the Muslim tradition. And there is a brilliant poet who is obviously deeply connected to God, who just wrote an extraordinary amount of extraordinary beauty and depth about the good, beautiful character of God. All that is to say that every tradition has its own aesthetic things in different ways, their own songs, their own modes of prayer, all that. And that gets us to number 6, that religions are communities of practice, that we all have our different way of doing our thing. So crosswalk within Christianity and Christianity as a whole, we generally worship on Sunday around the world, except for Seventh-day Adventists. That's okay, whatever. But that's how most of us are. We have baptism, we have communion. Those are key pieces of the Christian religious tradition and our practices. And finally, religions are communities of transformation. Don't miss how powerful this last one is. If you want to break down what salvation is all about, if you have heard that Jesus came to save, Jesus saves, and we find salvation in Jesus, you need to scratch out the word salvation and put transformation. Because at the end of the day, that is what the salvation is about. It is not so narrowly defined. It includes what happens to us after we die, but it's much bigger than that. If this is what happens after we die, then this is the fullest meaning of salvation. I can't get my arms wide enough to do that. And every tradition has their variation of that transformation, where your mind is changed, your identity is changed, and your footsteps are changed. That's what we're looking at. And every religion shoots for that along the way, in different ways, with language, images, art that comes out of their context. So this is where we start. And then we need to say something as well on the next screen, that religions are not all the same. They're not. And if anybody ever tells you, well, religions are all the same, well, that's absolute nonsense. They don't try to be the same. How could they be the same if they're coming out of different cultures and different times in history? It's impossible for them to be the same. They're not the same. However, they all affirm the more, the real, the sacred, so this greater other that we call God. They all affirm a path of transformation, so they have a way of getting to that. They all provide practices for the journey, like we just talked about. They all extol compassion, life's primary virtue, and they really, really do. I'll come back to that one. And they all contain collections of belief and teaching. So they all have their sacred writings and their sacred teachings that they try to pass on generation to generation. Now I want to back up to number 4 there, that they all extol compassion. Because in our country, we have a particular way of thinking about Islam. And I think a lot of Americans, when they think of Islam, they don't think of what Islam actually stands for, which is peace, but they think of a guy strapped with a bomb on his chest wanting to inflict major damage. It would be interesting to ask Muslims what they think about those terrorists who claim to be the quintessential Muslims. So in this interview that Sam did with Adam Hamilton, he talks about this, and he talks about this in the series that we're gonna jump into. And he said, post 9/11, something like 3,000 people outside of the Middle East have been killed by ISIS, this extremist group within Islam. Within Afghanistan and Iraq, which are predominantly Muslim people, that number is 120,000. So ISIS has killed its own people in the name of Islam. Mainstream Islam looks at ISIS as a terrible thing, as radical fundamentalists who do not represent their faith. And I wonder if we need to take notice of that and realize that that is not a fair representation of what Islam is about or most of its adherents. I got a Facebook message a few days ago from a crosswalker who'd caught a headline from Walnut Creek, and it was about a protest that was going to happen at the hands of Westboro Baptist Church from Topeka, Kansas. Yeah, okay, you've heard of them. Well, Westboro Baptist Church is the poster child of mean-spirited Christianity. They are radical fundamental Christianity, bar none. Nobody, they win at that one. Who's best at being radically fundamental Christians? It's Westboro Baptist. They have made themselves known as being people of hate. They're the ones who show up at vets' funerals and talk about how they're going to hell and that they're dead because of America's stance on gay issues and so on and so forth. They are the people who do horrific things, all while claiming to be God's chosen expression of Christianity. Nobody here at Crosswalk would ever line ourselves up with Westboro. In fact, we would distance ourselves, as do most churches in America, are going to distance themselves from that particular way of thinking because we're like, that does not reflect who we are. That is a very limited way of understanding the faith, and we'll have none of it. Well, I think we need to be thinking about that when we look at other world religions. And Islam, I've read the Quran, and I've talked with Muslims. And the Quran has as much violence in it as you'd find in our Old Testament, and similar veins. But an interesting thing about the Quran that often doesn't get articulated is that their picture of God is, at the end of the day, in its own words, a God of grace. In that, it says clearly on multiple occasions, if you know you've gone the wrong way and you turn back and you ask God for forgiveness, God will grant it. That's unmerited favor. That is the essence of grace. I shared this with you a year or two ago, but I think our last trip that we came back from Faraha, we were in Nairobi's airport. And going through security right behind our team was a group of clearly Muslim men. And they were all dressed in, looked like ceremonial type clothes. And so I assumed that they were all imams. So naturally I struck up a conversation and asked them where they're from, and they were from Pakistan. So not just a Muslim, but a Pakistan Muslim. I hit the you know, the mother lode here. And so I just asked one of them, who seemed to be friendly and spoke pretty good English, to say, hey, after we get through security and we're waiting around for our planes, can I just ask you some questions about your faith? And he was more than happy to do it. So we get through security, and we're hanging out, and this guy I talked to and another guy joined me and J.D. Lopez, who you've met here. He went on our last trip. And we had this conversation about faith. And most of the things that he said completely went with what I know about the Muslim faith and their basic ways of thinking. This guy was definitely a conservative Muslim, no doubt about it. I thought they were all imams, their version of a pastor. Nope, these were just a bunch of men on a month-long retreat in central, or actually off the coast of Africa. He was an engineer, the other guy was a doctor. So there we are having a conversation, and at the tail end of the conversation, I said, you know, in America there's kind of a particular way of thinking about Muslims in general. Is there anything you'd want to communicate to people in America about your faith? And he said, without a question, we are about peace. That's what we want for the world. We don't want all of this violence and terror and all that. So if Muslims themselves, and we have a Napa police officer who is Muslim, and we're probably going to comes up, because what do you do with that? That if you have this idea that Muslims are anti-peace, what do you do with the fact that we have a peace officer, or by your who happens to be a Muslim in Napa? When we call 911, do we ask for anybody but Omar? Because we're just not sure? Well, anyway, it's just bigger than we think, and it's complex. I have a good friend that is gay, and we had a long conversation 2 years ago because he is terrified that what's going to happen when Muslims get into the United States. Because he's gay, and he's just assuming that as soon as they're here, they're going to literally chop off his head. Kind of articulated this. Terrible, they're comical to look at, and the way they're trying to articulate things. Don't tell my friend that there are already several million Muslims in the United States. He'll just go off the deep end, right? So anyway, we have a bias against that religion since 9/11, and we need to look at that. But what I'm telling you is the Quran itself is no more violent than our own Old Testament, no matter what you've heard on talk radio or whatever. Now that leads us to a question about this whole idea of different paths going up the same mountain. Because a lot of times, and this would come out of the reductionist view, is somebody would just say, well, you know, all religions basically are trying to get to the same place. They're all trying to get up the mountain. And a Christian retort to that from an absolutist view would be, well, they might all be trying to go up the same mountain, but only one says it's going to get you to heaven for sure. And that's Christianity, because we know how the game is played. The game is about sin and making sure your sins are forgiven so that you can go into that very holy place. But as soon as we say that's how the game is played, we've already tilted our hand. because the Christian message is that the whole thing is about sin and getting rid of your sin, even though that message was not the dominant message of the Judaism that gave it its birth. So Borg twists the analogy a little bit, in a little bit more palatable way. He says, okay, let's stick with the mountain, and let's stick with different paths, but recognize this mountain is huge. It's sort of like entering into the Alps in Europe. If you enter the Alps from the direct south, you're going to be speaking Italian as you climb up the mountains, and you're speaking Italian from your friends in your team because you've all come from Italy, and you're eating good pasta all the way there. But other people from the West, they're going to attack that same range, but they're all going to be speaking French. And they're going to bring their French cultural tradition to that and eating amazing, fattening food every step of the way, which they're going to need as they go up. And saying things like oui, oui, and, you know, like that, because that's what you do if you're really French. And then you're going to have people from the north coming from Germany, and they're going to be coming into the Alps, and they're going to be doing all these guttural grunts and things like my ancestors used to do, eating their Wiener Schnitzel and whatever else, but drinking good beer along the way, and they're going to be going up this mountain. So what that is a reference to is, if every religion is coming from a particular cultural context, they are going to reflect that as they're trying to understand who the divine is. But the way Borg changes the variable, he says, when you start to get close to the peak, it's shrouded in clouds. You can't see the peak. It's mysterious. You're not exactly sure what it is up there. And he says if that's the variable that we're talking about, then every religion is trying to get you to that space, closer to the mystery, closer to the unknown. Because that is, from the sacramental vantage point, what religions are trying to do, is to connect us to that greater other. So a final note, you've already kind of figured this out, but the absolute position on this stuff, when you have absolute external forms, that always leads to exclusivism. That means that the dominant voice in the United States is going to be exclusive, because the dominant voices in the United States are born out of fundamentalism and evangelicalism. It means that almost every Protestant church in Napa is going to be coming from the exclusivistic view, because that is what their dogma and their doctrine demands. You cannot allow for any other religions to have room in the conversation, because by their own doctrine, this is the only one that is true and right. Which is why I remembered halfway through the 9 o'clock service that this is controversial and probably is messing with you more than I appreciate, because I've moved way beyond this and have been wrestling this for a very long time. And I'm comfortable with the dialogue. But if it's new to you, this probably sounds like utter heresy. And by the definition and by the construct of the evangelical fundamental game, it is heresy. But what I've been trying to say, and what Borg has been trying to communicate, is that that voice does not represent the original. That voice is a few hundred years old, and there needs to be more to the story. So that leads us to the next screen. One of the questions we might have is, well, let's just check religion, because obviously it's too confusing, it's going to be too hard to figure out. So Borg says to that religion is to spirituality as institutions of learning are to education. So let me ask you a simple question. If you decided to raise your kid, let's say you have a kid and it's getting up to school age, and you could get away with it. If Harlan Smetzer was still on the job, he wouldn't let you get away with it. But let's say you decided, all right, we are not going to send our kids to school. And I don't feel like homeschooling, because I didn't like school. Last thing I want to do is lead school. So we're just going to let the kid figure it out, see what happens. Will that kid live? Yeah. Will that kid learn stuff? Yep. Will that kid probably even get through life? Yeah, probably. You have functionally illiterate people walking around all over the place, and they somehow get through. But Is that life what it could have been? Did they learn all that would have helped them along the way? And the answer to that is clearly no. Educational systems, educational institutions speed things up. They give us tools along the way and help us stretch and grow every step of the way. And the fact is, the higher in education you go, the more you realize how much you don't know. So every high school graduate knows everything. Amen? Right? And then they go to college and they specialize in one thing. So mine was psychology. And what I realized at the end of 4 years studying psychology was there was a whole lot more about psychology that I had yet to learn. And then I went to get my master's so that I could be a pastor, and I dabbled in biblical studies and theology and all that. And with every passing course, as I took care of the qualifications for my master's, I realized, holy smokes, there is so much more for me to learn in theology and Bible studies and biblical studies and all that stuff. So when I got my doctorate, focused in on one thing and learned a lot. But as I learned a lot, I also recognized there is way more to learn than I have learned. And Christianity is like that. Religions allow you to go deeper, faster, because that's what they're there for. Does it mean we have to sort some things out and understand cultural things and all that? Sure it does. But to try to go it alone and just go with spirituality, I tell you what that will do. That'll get you through life, but like the kid who never gets any kind of formal education, it's going to be severely limited by the worldview that created you and your own comfort. Because you're not going to have ears to hear things that would be really instructive. You're not going to know the stories and the traditions that help shape you into the person you're really created to be. Religion is a gift in that way. External forms, not just spirituality, matters. Its forms are vessels of spirituality, mediators of the sacred and the way. So that leads to the question, well, what do we do with exclusive sounding scriptures? Like Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. What do we do with that? What do we do with other passages in Scripture which are clearly exclusivistic, saying this is it or you're toast? Well, Borg recommends, first of all, in that Jesus one, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, that there's a whole different way of reading that from a non-scientific theory way, which he's saying, okay, here's the checkbox, and you have to agree, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, or else you're going to hell. That's one way of thinking about it from a very black and white standpoint. Or there's another way of thinking about it, just to touch on this one briefly, where Jesus is saying, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one gets to the Father except for me. Because I've been embodying this way, I've been living in this truth. This is what it looks like, and this way leads you right into the arms of the Father. Follow me, and you will find the Father. So it's not this proof test kind of a thing at all, but a way of being. But the other thing that Borg says, which I think is really insightful, is to read that language as language of truth and devotion. That for people who say these things, it is absolutely and fundamentally true for them. They believe it, they own it, they live it. But that also that language is a word of devotion. So I'm here to tell you today, unequivocally, that I believe my wife is the most beautiful woman in the world. Some of you husbands out there may take issue with me, because if you're smart, you would raise your hand and say, Pastor Pete, my wife is the most beautiful woman in the world. And you would have answered correctly, right? Because I am speaking out of truth and devotion to my wife. Does that make sense? To take it in a little fuller direction about this way of thinking about devotion. If we talk about our country, the United States, which we love, I love so much about the country. I could go on and on and on. I could do a whole sermon about how much I love our country and the different aspects of our country. And we have songs that speak of our country. But the fact that I love the United States doesn't mean that I think France is a big fat loser, or that Italy should just fall off the map, or that Kenya should never. One part of devotion doesn't mean I have to exclude or even talk disparagingly about another. Does that make sense? And so there's this song. It's in your bulletin, and you're about to hear it. It's to the tune Finlandia. It's called This Is My Song. And it's a beautiful hymn sang beautifully on the next couple slides. So enjoy this. It'll play. There it is.
This is my song, O God of all the nations, a song of peace for lands afar and wide. This is my home, the country where my heart is. Here are my hopes, my dreams, my holy shrine. What other hearts in other lands are beating, with hopes and dreams as true and high as mine. My country's skies are bluer than the ocean, and sunlight beams on clover leaf and pine. But on the lands the sunlight too and clover, and skies are everywhere as blue as mine. This is my song, O God of all the nations, a song of peace for their land and for mine.
Isn't that pretty? I love the sentiment of this hymn, of this song, saying we love our country. And there are other people in other countries that love their country. So let them love their country. Let us love our country. Our love of our country doesn't make their countries losers. Does that make sense? Now, put some other words in there. Trade out country with religion, home with faith, and think about it that way. And it changes the way we think about pluralism. This all led Borg to end his book with a particular statement. When asking himself for the readers, why am I a Christian? On the next slide, he gives this response. He says, at the heart of Christianity is the way of the heart, a path that transforms us at the deepest level of our being. At the heart of Christianity is the heart of God, a passion for our transformation and the transformation of the world. At the heart of Christianity is participating in the passion of God. He expounds on these things, but that sums up why he's a Christian. And he remains a Christian, identifies himself as a Christian, and will never switch from being a Christian. The Dalai Lama was asked by a woman, a Christian woman, and she came up to him and said, should I become a Buddhist? And the Dalai Lama said, no, I think you should become a really good Christian. There's an old saying that if you want to find water, it is more wise to dig one well 60 feet deep than 6 wells 10 feet deep. I will forevermore be a Christian. I will do my best to follow in the footsteps of Jesus for all of the reasons that I've shared with you my entire 18 years here, because of the complexities of salvation and the beauty that it has, because of the future hope that we'll celebrate on Easter, but also because of what it calls us to do in this life, the healing, the fullness, the beauty, the service, everything it calls me to do and to be now. The kinds of relationships it creates, the kinds of community it creates, the kind of peace it creates. I'm sticking with it, and I'm continuing to go deeper in it. My question for you is, which is home for you? What is home for you? And my follow-up question is, how deep is your well? And did you stop digging at 10 feet? Because what I've discovered is the deeper we go trying to find the depths of Christianity, we find depths, but then we discover there are even more depths. And when we think we've found the beauty of Christianity, of our faith, we only discover that that's just the beginning of more beauty. And when we think we've seen the highest vista, we just recognize that there's another point from which we can see even further. How deep is your well? And what are you choosing to be? In the United States, Christianity rules the day. It's the language that we know culturally. It's the easiest go-to because it's like you're born into the story practically in the United States. My encouragement to you is go deep with that. Find out what it is capable of helping you foster in your life and in this world. How deep is your well? Let's pray together. So God, because this is a hotter topic than I've realized, I'm asking you to do your work. Not that I need to. You're already at work, but I'm asking that your Spirit help us discern how we get our heads around this stuff. And more importantly, how do we get our lives around this stuff? And if we can't quite get to the sacramental view of things, and if we're still defining Christianity as the only and the truest and all that, and of course it is for many of us here, but if we can't quite take that next step, then at a minimum, God, I would pray that we would adopt the language, the demeanor, and the tone of Jesus. And if we say we're Jesus followers, I pray that we really will be when we're talking to people of other faiths or talking about the faiths of other people. Remind us of Jesus with the woman at the well, who treated a woman that he could have easily ignored, cast aside, but instead treated her with dignity and respect, inviting her into the conversation and pointing to the Spirit of God. May we be your graceful, compassionate agents, catalysts in a world that is so severely divided. May we be sources of hope because we've actually decided to follow Jesus. May we bring peace, hope, and strength as we walk rooted in your love. I ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.